Hello, this is Dave. Today I want to talk about what I consider to be the biggest lie of all. It's a subject I've been looking at for the last 6 months, and I've been pretty hesitant to talk about it because, it's a really controversial subject. Now, I stumbled across this completely by accident. I was researching something on a totally unrelated topic and happened to see an intriguing sounding video. So I clicked on it, but the subject was so preposterous that I was just about to turn it off when it happened to say something that piqued my interest. So I watched the video completely to the end. And by the end of it, I had questions. I had some serious questions. So I'm going to ask you to be open-minded about this. This is very, very controversial and difficult to get your head round. So just bear with this and keep an open mind. So, in order to determine the truth, I'm going to be using a few principles here. The first of which is the scientific method, something that the scientific community doesn't seem to use these days. But the scientific method is where a theory or opinion is put forward that matches what we observe. But if something comes along that contradicts those observations, then the theory must be discarded. The second principle is Occam's razor. That's quite simply, the simplest explanation tends to be the truth. The third principle I'm going to be using is from Sherlock Holmes. When the impossible has been eliminated, whatever is left, however improbable, must be the truth. I'm also going to have to accept a couple of things. The first of which is what I call the ant's perspective. If you imagine an ant walking across a runway and all of a sudden a jumbo jet lands next to it, the ant's probably going to say, "What the hell was that?" But there is no way that the ant can ever figure out what just happened to it. It's just beyond the ant's ability to comprehend. So we have to accept that there may be things that are way beyond the human mind's ability to comprehend. The other thing we have to accept is how easily our minds, once they've been programmed or given a world view, how easily those minds can be fooled. You started watching that video with a certain world view. After all, you know what a room looks like. But those preconceptions caused you to ignore some of the subtle cues that would have given the game away, such as the black rectangle underneath the chair, or the difference in colour between the cups, or even the strange angles of the picture on the wall. You believed a visual lie because your world view was so powerful that it blinded you to any evidence that contradicted it. The other thing I'd like to mention at this point is how easily we can be fooled by two-dimensional imagery. We've been trained and conditioned to suspend disbelief when we see certain two-dimensional imagery, such as photographs. A photograph is not reality. It's a photograph. And photographs can be altered and manipulated. Video is not reality. And here's some examples of that. Pretty realistic stuff. Point is, you can't automatically trust any two-dimensional imagery or media that's presented to you by the establishment. So let's get down to it then, shall we? This is apparently the truth of our world. We live on a spherical planet called Earth, spinning at 1,000 miles an hour on a 23.4 degree tilt. Now, I always thought it was 23.5 degrees, but as I researched into this, I found it was actually 23.4. That's 23.4 degrees away from vertical. Funnily enough, that leaves 66.6 degrees away from the horizontal. Interesting. So anyway, we're orbiting an ordinary star that is apparently 93 million miles away. The Sun itself is embedded in a galaxy of 100 billion stars, and that galaxy is one of trillions and trillions in an infinite and expanding void. And in the midst of that void, we are just an insignificant and unimportant microbe that arrived here by accident, that's crawling around on this speck of dust. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh dear, he's turned into one of those flat earther people. But if you've ever discovered the truth behind all those things that have been labelled as conspiracy theories, you've been willing to set aside your preconceptions of the world to be able to accept a new and often terrifying version. This is no different, so please bear with me. The first thing that people will automatically say is, of course we live on a spherical Earth. We've got the photographic evidence, don't we? Well, strangely enough, when you try and search for a picture of Earth from space, you'll find surprisingly few of them. In fact, all of them, including this one, this is from NASA, it's called the Big Blue Marble. All of them are composites. NASA will freely admit to them being composite images or CGI or Photoshop. There's only one image that NASA will claim was shot from space, and it's this one. It's apparently shot from Apollo 17. But all of these images have problems. First of all, the scientist will tell you that because the Earth is spinning, centrifugal forces will force the equator to bulge out as it's spinning. So the Earth is more of an oblate spheroid. But, funnily enough, all the images from space, supposedly, are perfect spheres. Also, one thing I noticed is that the colours of continents and the sea itself, they're very vivid. Now, when you look at anything at a distance, maybe if you look at some hills at the distance of 3 or 4 miles, you'll see that the colours are kind of washed out somewhat because of the atmosphere. If you see mountains further off in the distance, the dark colours are washed out even more because of the influence of the atmosphere. So how can it be that you get these very vivid, striking colours through miles of atmosphere? I can't explain it. The other strange thing about this supposed shot of Earth from space is that the continents actually appear to match the Mercator map rather than the Peters projection map. Now, if you don't know the difference, here's a little video to explain it.
Should we begin?
Yes. Plain and simple, we'd like President Bartlett to aggressively support legislation that would make it mandatory for every public school in America to teach geography using the Peters projection map instead of the traditional Mercator.
Give me $200 and it's done.
Really? No. Why are we changing maps?
Because, CJ, the Mercator projection has fostered European imperialist attitudes for centuries and created an ethnic bias against the Third World.
Really?
The German cartographer, Mercator, originally designed this map in 1569 as a navigational tool for European sailors.
The map enlarges areas at the poles to create straight lines of constant bearing or geographic direction.
So it makes it easier to cross an ocean.
But
Yes.
It distorts the relative size of nations and continents.
Are you saying the map is wrong?
Oh dear, yes. Look at Greenland.
Okay.
Now look at Africa.
Okay.
The two land masses appear to be roughly the same size.
Yes.
Would it blow your mind if I told you that Africa is in reality 14 times larger?
Yes?
Here we have Europe, drawn considerably larger than South America. When it's 6.9 million square miles, South America is almost double the size of Europe's 3.8 million.
Alaska appears 3 times as large as Mexico, when Mexico is larger by 0.1 million square miles.
Germany appears in the middle of the map when it's in the northernmost quarter of the Earth.
Wait. Relative size is one thing, but you're telling me that Germany isn't where we think it is?
Nothing's where you think it is.
Where is it?
I'm glad you asked. The Peters projection.
It has fidelity of axis.
Fidelity of position.
East-west lines are parallel and intersect north-south axes at right angles.
What the hell is that?
It's where you've been living this whole time. Should we continue?
Uh-huh.
So, you're probably wondering what all of this has to do with social equality.
No, I'm wondering where France really is.
Guys, we want to thank you very much for coming in.
Hang on, we're gonna finish this.
Okay.
What do maps have to do with social equality, you ask?
She asked.
Salvatore Natoli of the National Council for Social Studies argues, in our society, we unconsciously equate size with importance and even power.
I'm going to check in on Toby.
Go.
These guys find Brigadoon on that map. You'll call me, right?
Probably not.
Okay.
When third world countries are misrepresented, they're likely to be valued less. When Mercator maps exaggerate the importance of Western civilization, when the top of the map is given to the northern hemisphere and the bottom is given to the southern, then people will tend to adopt top and bottom attitudes.
But wait, where else could you put the northern hemisphere but on the top?
On the bottom.
How?
Like this.
Yeah, but you can't do that.
Why not?
Because it's freaking me out.
So the Mercator map was designed as a navigational aid, but the Peters projection map is a more accurate rendering of what the continents look like. So why then do all the images of Earth from space show the Mercator map? I guess that's because that's what we're used to. Even the one image that is claimed to be an actual photograph of Earth from space is called into question, simply because of a film that was released accidentally by NASA of Apollo 11 faking the very first picture of Earth from space. So let's have a look at that video.
An old reel received by mistake. It contains the raw or unedited footage of the crew of Apollo 11, Michael Collins, Edwin Aldrin Jr. and Neil Armstrong, staging part of their mission for nearly an hour in living color, with exceptionally clear behind-the-scenes audio of conversations discussing the techniques used to achieve a disingenuous picture depicting the Earth at a distance, in order to falsely demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. It cannot be misconstrued that this staging was done for some other reason, for the reel itself is slated and dated July 18th, 19th and 20th, 1969, the very days of the mission when they were said to be approaching and achieving lunar orbit. Understand, too, that only about 20 seconds of this raw footage was ever broadcast to the public, and these conversations discussing their deception were believed to be private. Until now. Here they discuss that these television transmissions were in fact not broadcast live as everyone believed. They were first screened and edited for playback later.
Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get the playback, we can sort of correlate what we're so much.
Here they discuss the fact that they have turned out the lights and have blocked out sunlight from entering the spacecraft through the other windows, as to not cause any reflected light to fall onto the spacecraft's wall in the foreground.
Okay, very good. Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other windows into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light.
The reason this was done is so that the truth of the matter would not be revealed. It is this. Though the federal government would have you believe that this is a view of Earth from a distance out of the spacecraft's window as it nears the moon, it is not. What they have ingeniously done is placed the camera at the back of the spacecraft and centered the lens on a circular window in the foreground, outside of which it is completely filled with the Earth in low orbit. The circumference of the window then appears to be the diameter of the Earth at a distance, with the darkened walls of the spacecraft appearing to be the blackness of space around it. That is why they wanted the interior dark and blocked out the sun from any other windows. Here you can see the extruded window, probably 2 inches thick at the bottom. This is because the Earth's shine is coming in at a downward angle. It also causes the Earth to appear to be an irregularly shaped circle, for you are seeing the outside of the window at the bottom and the inside of the window at the top, which together form 2 different sized halves of a circle. Subsequently, this take was never used. As they perfected the shot, a crescent-shaped piece of black material was inset slightly into the window to create the illusion of the Earth's terminator line dividing night and day. It is uncannily convincing. During this segment, intended to be edited and played back later for the worldwide television audience, dated July 18, 1969, Neil Armstrong condemns himself as he states that he is 130,000 miles out, or halfway to the moon, as the NASA flight log also states on this date, when he is in reality in low Earth orbit of a few hundred miles.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
Here, during another segment, also intended to air after review, Neil Armstrong falsely explains to the viewers how the shot is attained by putting the camera's lens to the window's glass, as it would have to be if they were the claimed distance away from the Earth.
We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera.
If the window was completely filled up with a TV camera, as he stated, then an astronaut's arm would not be able to get between the camera and the window, as it obviously does here in this outtake.
South America becomes invisible just off beyond the Terminator or inside the shadow.
You can also notice how the astronaut operating the camera reacted to the mistake by attempting to pan away from it.
Blue gas. See white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth. And
This is a segment that they believed wasn't even being recorded, much less suitable for broadcast, for the lens was being zoomed out and the scene was being changed to that of an interior of the astronauts at work, and apparently the stop button popped back up on the recorder without notice. Here is the diffused work light that they used to see camera controls, but not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up to see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window. Here is the slate for the 19th of July, and the same shot of trickery on the 19th of July, and then the 20th, and the same misleading shot on the 20th. Later that evening, they were said to be walking on the moon. How can this be when they were in Earth orbit only 9 hours earlier, and the moon is some 3 days' journey?
And you can see the full sequence on a documentary called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. That's one that I highly recommend you have a look at. But as for photographic evidence of a globe Earth, nope, it doesn't exist. Now let's take a look at Earth's supposed curvature. Many people point to Felix Baumgartner's recent record-breaking freefall jump and point to this picture in particular. It clearly shows a curvature of the Earth, but let's take a closer look at it. Well, it's quite obvious that a fisheye lens is used here. If you look at the shape of the capsule itself, those are usually built with fairly straight lines, and you can see the lines are very curved on the edge of this capsule. He took off from New Mexico, and the surface of the Earth looks like, well, it's one big large landmass, and that's New Mexico. I didn't realise that New Mexico took up so much of the Earth. It's clearly a fisheye lens. We know intuitively, if we stand on a beach with a panoramic view, that the sea is flat. It's flat at sea level, it's flat from the top of Mount Everest, it's flat from over 20 miles high. I got this image from another YouTuber. I can't remember the guy's name, but he's the one who goes, "Where is the curvature? Where? But it's a picture of the New York City skyline from over 40 miles away. He says it's 60 miles away, but I measured it on Google Earth. It's 40 miles away. The reason I added this one is because I used to live halfway between Bear Mountain and New York City, and from North Route 17, I was clearly able to see the New York City skyline from about 20 miles away. From 40 miles away, the New York City skyline should have been about 1,000 feet below the horizon. And that neatly leads me into the horizon problem. No matter where you are above the surface of the Earth, the horizon always rises to your eye level. Doesn't matter if you're standing on a beach, or up a hill, or in a plane at 35,000 feet. The horizon is always at eye level. Well, that would be impossible on a spherical Earth, because the Earth would curve away from you, and so it would always appear below you. As on this diagram, the expected horizon would be below you, but that's not what we see. When you look out of a plane window, you always see the horizon at eye level. And it doesn't matter how big you make the Earth below the plane, the horizon would always appear below you. In 240 BC, a Jesuit named Eratosthenes, my apologies to any ancient Greeks among you, he calculated the Earth's circumference. He did that by planting a stick in the ground at midday so that the sunlight, being directly overhead, would cast no shadow. Simultaneously, about 400 miles away, somebody else planted the stick in the same way and found that the sunlight cast a shadow. So by taking a shadow length and knowing the distance between the sticks, you could theoretically work out the circumference of the Earth. Take note that this method requires that the sun be a long, long way away so that the light coming from the sun is all parallel. Just keep that in the back of your mind, because we'll come back to this later. However, it turns out that you'd get exactly the same results on a flat Earth if the sun were only 3,100 miles away and 34 miles across. Now, as crazy as that might sound, I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind, because we're going to come back to this as well. Perhaps the most famous experiment to disprove the idea of a curvature was performed by Samuel Rowbotham in the late 1800s. The Old Bedford Levels experiment was performed on a canal in Cambridgeshire, which is perfectly straight for 6 miles. What Rowbotham did was put a telescope 6 inches above the water at one end of the canal and had a friend row a boat to the other. The boat had a flag on it, and Rowbotham was able to see the boat and the flag along the entire length of the journey. Now, if the Earth were curved, the boat should have been 16 feet below the horizon at the other end of the canal. Plenty of other such proofs exist concerning landmarks that can be seen much further away than the curvature of the Earth would allow. The most notable would be the Notre Dame Antwerp spire, which stands about 403 feet high and 468 feet above sea level. But sea captains are able to see the spire with a telescope from an amazing 241 kilometres away. If the Earth were a globe, then the spire would be actually a whole mile below the horizon. The Earth has a curvature? I don't think so. So let's take a look now at the idea that the Earth is spinning. Our common sense intuition tells us that the Earth is motionless. We have senses that detect changes in velocity. Why is it then, if you've, say, always lived in England, where the velocity of the Earth there is something around, I think it's 700 miles an hour, and you get on a plane and fly down to the equator, where it's actually spinning at over 1,000 miles an hour, why is it that you don't feel dizzy and notice the change in velocity? Well, we'll ignore that. There are many theories that supposedly show that the Earth is spinning. But I want to concentrate on one such theory, which is that the motion of the stars prove that the Earth is spinning. This theory proposes that the stars are static, fixed and unchanging, and it's the Earth that's spinning around at 1,000 miles an hour, and that the axis of spin is pointing at a particular star called Polaris, the pole star. So, from an observer on the Earth, it appears that the stars are spinning around the star Polaris. Now, Polaris is something like 2 quadrillion miles away, and as far as we know, the polar axis has always pointed at Polaris. So, the first obvious question is, if the Earth is wobbling on its axis and moving around the Sun, and also being dragged along with the rest of the solar system, how can it remain perfectly aligned with a star that's 2 quadrillion miles away? Well, we'll put that aside for the moment and just concentrate on the motion of the stars. If you were to set up a camera pointing at Polaris in the night sky and leave it on a long exposure, you'd get a pattern of star trails around Polaris, supposedly reflecting the 1,000 mile an hour spin of the Earth. But wait a minute, isn't the Earth orbiting the Sun at 67,000 miles an hour? And come to think of it, isn't the Sun moving through the galaxy at 600,000 miles an hour? Then why is it the only motion we see is the slowest one, when the orbit around the Sun is 67 times faster than the supposed spin of the Earth, and the motion of the Sun, dragging the solar system behind it, is 600 times faster than the spinning of the Earth? Something doesn't add up. The point is, you wouldn't see these perfectly circular star trails. If you took into account all the other relative motions, you just wouldn't see these perfect circles. Where is the motion? Where? The simplest answer is the Earth isn't spinning or orbiting or being dragged. The Earth is fixed, and it's the stars that are moving. So now let's turn our attention to the Sun. What do you think is wrong with this picture? Any idea? Well, take a look at the angle of the rays. If the Sun was 93 million miles away, as I show in this diagram, well, actually, I can't really show 93 million miles to scale here, because if it was, the Earth would be probably in the next town. Point is that at that kind of distance, all the light rays from the Sun would be parallel near enough. And, if you recall, Eratosthenes' calculation of the circumference of the Earth actually depends on the light being parallel from the Sun. So, when the light shines through broken cloud, it would hit the ground parallel rather than at this kind of angle. So, if you're able to measure the angle of these sun rays, you can basically, with a bit of simple geometry, figure out exactly how high the Sun is. And that turns out to be about 3,100 miles. And if you were going to try and hide this information, that the Sun is actually very close, perhaps you'd encode it in symbol. Does this look familiar? There are quite a few videos like this one where people send up their video cameras on weather balloons. One thing to note is where you can see a hot spot on the clouds directly under the sun, like here. You see it? Directly under the sun is a hot spot. Now, that would be impossible if the sun was 93 million miles away. But also note how the sun appears to move with the Earth. As the camera rocks about, you'll see the sun moving around with the Earth. Now again, if the sun was 93 million miles away, you wouldn't see that. Just like if you were on a speeding train, the trees next to the track will whiz past you, but the mountains in the distance would, well, they'd hardly move. And if the sun was behind those mountains, the sun wouldn't move at all. So just like in this diagram, you can see there's a sun a long, long way off and a sun that's directly above the kind of landscape. And as the camera is simulated to move here, you can see that the closer sun is moving with the simulated Earth here. But the one further away moves as if it was further away. You can see it hardly moves in relation to the Earth. Again, that's not what we see in these videos. The sun appears to be directly above the flat Earth. In the flat Earth model, the sun rotates around us and only appears to rise and set because of the way our vision works. We see in perspective. That is, the horizon is at our eye level, and as things recede from us, they tend to converge to the centre of that horizon line, to a place that's known as the vanishing point. Just as if you were standing at the end of a very long corridor, you would see that the walls would appear to converge. The floor would appear to rise up to meet the horizon, and the ceiling would also appear to move downwards. Of course, the walls and the ceiling are all parallel to each other, so they don't actually move anywhere, but it would just appear that way. And anything that lies beyond the vanishing point is effectively invisible to us. It's beyond the limit of our vision. The clouds in this picture are all at the same height, but the further they are away from you, the lower down in the sky they appear to be. And similarly, the further away the cloud shadows are on the ground, the higher up they appear to be. Now, try and watch the following video without the preconception that the sun rises and sets, but rather moves closer to you and then moves further away. I'm afraid I can no longer take the idea that the sun is 93 million miles away very seriously at all. So now let's turn our attention to the moon. Many of us have seen the moon appear full at various times throughout the day, as in this picture. But how can that happen? If you're standing at point C, then it's the middle of the night. Full moon, no problem. And if you're standing at point A, it's early in the morning. Certainly if you stare back at the moon in the night sky, then yes, you can see a full moon. But if you're standing at point B, which is midday, that is, the sun is directly overhead, then there isn't anywhere that the moon can be that will allow you to see it as full, because the sun will be illuminating the side of the moon that is facing away from you. So the best you'll be able to see is a sliver of the moon. Think about it next time you see the full moon during the day. Every month the moon goes through 8 distinct phases. Always the same 8, always the same order. Supposedly because of a relationship between the position of the moon relative to the position of the Earth and the Sun. So let's say it's December, and throughout the month we see the normal 8 phases of the moon. But what happens when it's June and the Earth is supposedly on the other side of the Sun? Shouldn't the phases be reversed? That's not what we see. We see the same 8 phases in the same order. We are told that the moon is also spherical, but when we look at the moon, it seems to be lit uniformly over its entire surface. But if it was a sphere reflecting the sun, then that curved surface would display a highlight, and then that light would drop off as it went round the surface. But that's not what we see. The entire moon is lit uniformly. The quality of the light from the moon is completely different from the sun's light. The sun's light is hot and it's shifted towards the yellow part of the spectrum, whereas the light from the moon is cold and more silvery. Heat is essentially infrared light. So in order for the moon to absorb the heat from the sun and not reflect it, it would have to be a deep green colour to absorb the infrared. So unless the moon is made out of green cheese, it is not reflecting the sun's light. It appears that the moon is not a sphere and it's not reflecting the sun. It is self-luminous. Also, we should be able to see a slightly different view of the moon depending on where on the globe Earth we happen to be. But this is not what we see. It doesn't matter where we are on Earth, we always seem to see the same view of the moon. Now, my friend Nolan pointed out that this is obviously a very exaggerated picture. The moon is supposedly 30 Earth diameters away from the Earth itself. But even so, that difference in position should give you a slight difference from point A to point B. But again, that's not what we see. So apparently the moon is 238,000 miles away. But if you just put that aside for a second and just look at the moon, perhaps you'll notice this. In this example, only the clouds close to the moon are lit up, not the clouds further away. That indicates that the moon is much, much closer than we've been told. Because if the moon were 238,000 miles away, then all the clouds should be illuminated, not just the ones closest to it. And here's an example of a schoolboy mistake. This is a famous picture from Apollo 8, which is entitled Earthrise. It was taken from above the moon's surface, looking back at the Earth. The only problem is, the Earth appears the same size as the moon appears from the Earth. But the Earth is 4 times the size of the moon. So it should have looked like this. Somebody screwed up. Now, there will be some people who still think we went to the moon. I can't believe that there are still people who think that 1969 technology went over 400,000 miles, managed to navigate to the moon using computers that were orders of magnitude less powerful than the first iPhone, passing through the immensely hazardous Van Allen radiation belts, which, by the way, NASA cannot figure out how to get through today, somehow landed on the moon, spent a delightful few days planting flags, playing golf, riding around on dune buggies, and then took off, or rather levitated off the lunar surface, only briefly nipping back to pick up the person operating the camera, and returned safely. And not just once, but 7 times. It's a fantasy. The whole thing is a fantasy. Everything you saw supposedly on the moon was in a soundstage using Stanley Kubrick's perfected front projection technology. And I'm not going to spend much time. There's plenty of evidence to show that it was completely faked. It was complete fantasy. Sorry, couldn't resist it.